Hello, you're listening to the Beer Ladies podcast with me, Katie, and my friends. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Mastodon, this thing called Blue Sky, TikTok. Our handle there is at Beer Ladies Pod. And if you're on Facebook, it's at Beer Ladies Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can find our merch store link in any of our bios or in the show notes for the episode. And also on our website, which is beerladiespodcast.com. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, please email us at beerladiespodcast@gmail.com. Now, back to the show.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Beer Ladies podcast. My name is Tandy, and I am joined today by Lisa and Christina. Hello, friends. And we are going to be talking about this very interesting question. And it came up actually because of co-host Katie, who couldn't make it today. And she wanted to know whether certain beer styles had emerged through history because of the weather in that place, or the climates, or the local ingredients, in that particular part of the world, or even inter-country, the part of a regional sort of specificity. And that got us thinking, along with a bunch of news articles that we've seen over the last few years about the effect of climate and weather on beer production. Not just do styles change, but what happens when we've had bad weather and can't grow enough barley, or what happens to our hops if they're not growing the way they should? How is the climate affecting our beer ingredients and thusly our beer? So we're going to unpack all of that today, and it'll probably have a bit of history, have a little bit of pop history, maybe, maybe not, and then we'll posit our own thoughts about how things might move forward. So before we dig deep into climate, what are we drinking today, friends? Christina, let's start with you.
Goose egg. I am not drinking anything.
Fair enough. On this glorious, it is Sunday when we're recording, and it probably is the sunniest, warmest day we've had in the whole year. It's magnificent outside.
I have some glorious popsicles calling my name. There are these raspberry lemonade popsicles from Aldi that are they remind me of my childhood, and I have a box of them, and I'm going to probably eat them all, and I don't care. So
Sounds amazing. Sounds gorgeous. All right, Lisa, have you got a beer today?
I have indeed, although I am being good since I did go to a beer festival yesterday, so trying to be much more chill today. So I have Low Tide Brune DMC. So I think Low Tide is actually rebranded. I think they're now called Below Beer or Below Brewing, something like that now, but they are a low, no alcohol, brewery out of the UK. I think they are in Bath. But this is interesting. It's meant to be kind of, like a Belgian sort of Abbey brown ale. And it's not as dark as some of those might be. And it's certainly, certainly different from kind of a traditional one with booze in it, in that it's a lot drier, which is, sometimes too, your non-alcohol beers can be kind of sweet, but for this style, it's actually much drier than the usual thing would be. So it's actually quite interesting and really, really refreshing. But I thought, the Guinness Zero is so good. I'd try a darker non-alcoholic beer from someone and give it a go. So it's actually very nice. We'll try other beers from them. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I think Belgium is a nice sort of microcosm of everything you were saying, in such a small place, and how the local ingredients and the local climate would have really affected availability and how these things all come together. But we'll get into that. But Tammy, what have you got?
Well, I've got something that I think speaks to a little bit of what we're doing today, and it is called Shop Local.
Oh, very good.
And it's a collaboration between Two Sides Brewing Company at our friends Brickyard in Dundrum. And it's also with 57 The Headline, RIP, because they unfortunately closed a couple of months ago. But so that this one I've had for a little while, but it's an IPA. It's got Citra, Topaz, and Columbus, and it's a 6%er. But yes, I like that it's a shop local, because we're talking about what is how did things happen? How did things emerge based on what was local to you? And so I think that's a fitting beer. Very pretty, all the wrong glassware as usual, in a Wicklow Wolf glass, but it's very pretty, very summery looking.
That's lovely.
Okay, so friends, if I had to pitch a question at you, like, tell me about a beer that is so specific to its location or so specific to its climate. Like what comes to mind? Anything specific?
Oh gosh, I feel like you could say all of them, right? Like to some
Yeah.
extent, they all have that initial tie-in. But I think yes, as well. We're going to throw to Christina first because she's got some
Oh
nice,
no,
she's
no,
got
we're
some
not
good
gonna.
stuff.
No, don't worry, don't worry. Because I'll give you some answers. I'll give
Yeah.
you some answers. It's
I mean, like,
yeah.
yeah, it's honestly like everything. Like you
Yeah.
use what's around you, so you use the grain that's available to you. I mean, we could see this from like beers that are around the world, like sake and chicha,
Yeah.
and they use what is local to you, what's familiar to you, and sorghum beers, and we have wheat beers, barley beers, all these sorts of beers are used what's around you, what grows where you live. I mean, it's only really in recent years, considering the span of humanity existing on the planet, that we are, growing things probably in regions, and things have we're more connected perhaps than we used to be, many thousands of years ago. And this is, I would argue, in the span of like humanity, a more newer development. And this is like the whole span of humanity from like beginning,
Yeah.
not like, oh, this only
Yeah.
happened 5 years ago, folks. But yeah, that's what I would say. So Tandy, what would
Yeah.
you say?
Ding, ding, ding. Correct. So, I mean, I think we all know this. We know that, in Central and Southern Americas, we've got things like chicha. So, because corn grew really well, that would have been a ingredient, a primary ingredient in beer making. Similarly with rice, in places where rice grew. And, we spoke about this not long ago on gimmicky or weird and wacky beers, where we spoke about pumpkin beers, where the use of pumpkins or fruits or other kinds of fermentable sugars,
Yeah.
would have been done seasonally based on what grows naturally and locally. And that's like pretty common, right? So I think we all know that. So that takes care of, to some degree, what is being fermented, what is in the base. We've spoken about different kinds of grains before, sorghum and millet, being really popular in African beers, as they came through. And in certainly sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa, beer was not at all what we think of beer today. It wasn't light, clear,
Right.
not necessarily super carbonated, and it wasn't very industrialized at all. So it almost looked like kind of frothy milk, to some
Right.
degree. And that's because, ingredients, processes, and methods and things have all, grown at different times in different places using what's local. So that all makes sense. But there are some kind of examples that I think are maybe a little famous, at least in the sort of Western world, let's call it that. And it comes down to things like water, your water profile. We've heard before that Burton-on-Trent, the home of the pale ale, came to be because the water there is particularly high in sulfates. So, it gave the beers a certain kind of flavor or mouthfeel. It enhanced certain things of the ingredients, so the fruitiness of hops and of different grains. So that's one of the more famous profiles. And that is, again, based on what the water was like when they started brewing, with a very big caveat that nowadays, even these famous water places actually treat their water, to make it as consistent as possible. But these, might have been how things started. Pilsen in Czechia, also soft water, low ions. That gave their Pilsners a specific kind of taste. And that, was something that people chased in a way for a long time. It's also possibly the reason that Pilsners don't really taste the same all around the world, because you can have the same recipe, as in water, grains, hops, but based on where the hops are grown, how far they've had to travel, how long you've had to store them, what your water's like, things will change. But these are some, kind of famous-ish history or famous places where water was a big driver. By the way, not forgetting, of course, our very own Dublin, because Guinness, the Dublin water high in carbonates, and that I think is particularly useful for stouts and darker beers, stouts and porters. Whereas it's not as easy, to be honest, if you're a home brewer anyway, it's not as easy to brew hoppy beers here that taste the same way that they might taste elsewhere. So water plays a really big role, as do grains, or what your fermentable sugars. Doesn't always have to be a grain. The other things that emerged over time were things like yeast. So we know that yeast was a big topic. We now split beers broadly into ales and lagers based on, ales being top fermenting and give off slightly fruitier notes and esters, and they ferment warmer. Whereas, lager yeasts now ferment colder, longer, and they're more crisp, more kind of clean. Those are some of the big ones that we know about. Of course, things like wild yeasts would have been very local. So we've spoken about Norwegian farmhouse brewing. We've spoken to an extent across many episodes about things like saisons, and even a lot of the Belgian brews, Lisa, like you mentioned, would have had yeasts that were not, they didn't come from a packet like they kind
Exactly.
of do today. It would have been what's in the air. How do we cultivate this? How do we use what we've got today? And how do we maintain the kind of level and flavor that we like? So yeasts were obviously another big one. But hops will leave for a little longer because hops are the one that kind of emerge in an interesting and weird way, and one of the first things to be really kind of industrialized and globalized to an extent that hop import export was happening certainly in the late 1800s. But hopped beers and unhopped beers, which is almost the old, Christina and Lisa, keep me honest here, but beer was hopped, ale was unhopped. And that was way before we got this distinction of lager and ale. So we've got, hops being a thing, yeast being a thing, your fermentable grains or sugars being a thing, your water being a thing. There's also a bunch of processes or methods that will have given life to a bunch of different beers. So one of the more famous ones is when we started to get pale beers, because drying malt was something that happened for many centuries. But when we started drying malts in different ways or over different materials or for different lengths of time, we got paler or darker malts. What we've spoken before about how most beers back in the day would have probably been quite dark because any dried malt would have been done over a fire, not as controlled. But when we started doing it over coke, new word for me today, coke, which is a kind of coal, it produced a lighter malt, and that was that helped spread the idea of paler beers, whether lager, ale, doesn't matter, but paler beers started to become a thing from the late 1600s, early 1700s, which I think is really fascinating because along with learning how fermentation works, figuring out temperatures and refrigeration and the effects on beers, this all sort of happened across history. And as soon as knowledge could be shared and processes could be shared, things started to happen at a much more global level, which really that's where we are today. We're in this place where you can buy your hops from the USA as well as New Zealand. You can buy your various malts locally, internationally, rice from China and corn from Mexico. And you can make almost, your own Frankenstein beer, and it doesn't need to be local anymore. But way back in the day, it absolutely did, pre-industrialization. But how then has weather affected this? Because, we can see how it might have started that way, but do we know much about how weather has affected things, especially post-industrialization?
It's a good question. And I think one other little historical tidbit to go back to for a second, and that's specifically kind of about the weather, or I'll say the sort of the weather / climate. But for the longest time there was this idea that wherever the Roman Empire was, that they were all drinking wine. They thought everyone was sort of barbaric drinking beer, but it's not quite so clear cut as that. It's really about what could be grown locally. So we still have this divide across Europe where people are making wine versus where they're making beer. And it's not just that the Romans rocked up and were like, we're fancy, we drink wine. Like they were, like you're saying, still like importing these things back and forth. But if it was easier to make wine or easier to make beer, they would do
Right.
whatever was local for kind of the bulk of what they were doing. So I think that's very interesting. It's been kind of a little bit debunked that it's been kind of there, that they were like snooty and only wanted wine, and that, you know, kind of looked down on everyone. No, we do still get that in kind of the Greek world, but it's interesting that it has come back down to basics and less about like, it was this great sort of, you feel like, cultural shift, and more, this is what was handy. You know, people just had what could be grown. And I think, you know, then to sort of bring it back around, the bit about like, how does this change? Like, where you can grow grapes now is getting kind of further and further north. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? It certainly makes it harder to grow barley then too. So that's like, you know,
Yeah.
you sort of pick one and, you know, they change.
I think the problem is a lot of people speak in absolutes. I mean, there's definitely evidence. I mean, the Romans were brewing. There's
absolutely.
even evidence of women who were brewing in the Roman Empire. So like and it's the same thing, like, you know, French wine was imported into various countries.
Exactly.
And so like but like in Ireland, that was really expensive to do.
Exactly.
So, there's, and this is in the early medieval period, you know, they're drinking mead, they're drinking beer, or well, I shouldn't say beer, I should say ale at this point. And yeah, well, circling back to your ale and beer thing, at some, ale and beer are originally two different things, then with hops, and then eventually ale also gets hops, and it gets really, really complicated, and we're not going to get into that. But yeah, so it's all kind of a bit of a mishmash, but like, yeah, it's just like what was kind of easier to make, and then it gets on its own. Oh, it's very expensive to have in Ireland or in England because it is imported. So then it takes on like, well, if it's more expensive, it's a high value item. If it's a high value item, then it's a wealthy thing, and so then it takes this whole like, gets a life of its own. But yeah, it's quite interesting. It's a lot of it is just basically local. But if we're going to talk about weather and beer, I do have an interesting example about weather and ale and beer making from the 1600s. So we're going to talk about the harvest crisis of 1647 through 1650, which is really, really not a good thing. So basically, bad weather ruined these consecutive harvests, and they basically compounded it. So there were really bad summer rains, and then there was a drought, and then there was really bad frost, and this just created a really bad grain problem. So Steve Hindle, and I'm going to link this in the show notes, wrote a really amazing article on this called "The Harvest Crisis of 1647 through 1650," and I really recommend it. It's a really interesting, fascinating article about all the details. But I'm going to give you some highlights about what happened during this crisis as it relates to beer brewing and malting and ale houses. So basically, as you know, if the harvest is bad, then what's left to be sold is going to be more expensive. There's a shortage, it's more expensive, just like we saw with COVID. What happens is people, they gouge prices, they drive up, this is what people do, and they have been doing it for a very long time.
Right.
So
supply and
people
demand.
wanted,
yeah.
Right, and then people, of course, take advantage of that. So the people found themselves in a situation where they're really, really wanting this grain for food. So they wanted the magistrates and the government to take action against maltsters, because they're thinking this grain that these maltsters are using, that have, they have other jobs that they can be doing. They're wealthy, which was one of the charges, that these men are taking this grain that needs to be used, that these people were petitioning, that needs to be used for food. We need to feed people before we're turning things into malt and then beer and ale. And so, they are making these petitions to their local governments, to the magistrates. They're protesting. You need to be regulating the malting industry. What are you doing about these ale houses? Why are all these people licensed? You need to be suppressing these maltsters. It's really interesting, the kind of divide that you see coming into play here, about this grain needs to be feeding people before it needs to be turning into to beer. And we have lots of arguments in history about this idea that, beer is nutritional, beer is part of diet, beer is an important part of, what you need to get your nutritional value. And I'm not disagreeing with that statement
Right.
to some way or another, but it's very clear here that they're putting the preference on food. You
Mm.
know, we need this grain needs to be given to the poor. And that's what they're very clear. Like cheeks, there was some quote about cheeks need to be not hollow anymore. You know, before we need to stop giving all these licenses to maltsters because people need to be we need to reduce
Mm.
the amount of poor people. And in order to do that, the grain needs to be turned into bread so people can eat.
Mm.
And I mean, that might also have something to do with the cost of beer and how they can't afford, you know, there are all these other, you know, things that play into it. But I did think it was really, really interesting that they were making that argument. And I'm sure someone will be like, well, obviously. But yeah, they were definitely taking their aim at the malting industry, the brewing industry, and the ale houses because this grain needed to feed people. Um,
Yeah. And it's
and
it's
that
Yeah.
so
all
interesting.
comes
Yeah.
from the weather.
Right. Absolutely. It's so interesting too, because I know we've talked about it, or you've certainly talked about it in your book too, about, how maltsters, and you get the same with millers too, they have this reputation of cheating people or ripping people off. That's, whether or not it's deserved, if you like, that's kind of, you see it in ballads, you see it it's just become a sort of stereotype that these are the professions, largely because you have to assume they're taking, this raw material and doing something with it behind closed doors. And certainly some people are doing some dodgy stuff with it, but it's interesting that these professions get this reputation, so they kind of become, you have to think, to a certain extent, kind of easy targets in this kind of situation where the harvest has been bad. There's a civil war that's been going on for
Yeah, that's all that
quite a
adds to
while.
this as well.
So you've got all these competing, sort of interests, and I'm sure there's just sort of general chaos, but they get sort of, this sort of laser focus, and it's interesting to see, like, well, would the, let's say that the bakers have been doing any better? Like, we don't
Yeah,
really
well,
know.
yeah, and in fairness, in Steve
Yeah,
Hindle's article, he does talk about other people
yeah,
besides, you know, brewers,
sure.
that were targeted. I just wanted to pull that
Oh
part
yeah,
out.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, there's definitely this idea of like we're graders and hucksters and people who were specifically trying to. There were other specific like middlemen who were in
yeah,
particular trying to drive up the grain prices in general. So it wasn't just maltsters, but there was definitely a a desire to suppress maltsters and to stop licensing them, which I think, you know, would be understandable
yeah,
given the fact that, you know, we are starving and the food needs to be. But yeah, equally, like you said, Lisa, there's definitely this idea. What is it? John Lydgate's on thieving millers or whatever, he
mm.
talks about how they should build their guild chapel at the pillory since most of their members are going to end up there anyway. So there is
Ouch.
definitely
Yeah,
like a long-standing idea, particularly of people in like the food and drink business, that they're ripping off their customers, and that's probably been going on for a while. So there's definitely that idea. Um, Absolutely right. That's probably compounded by this, but I find all this quite interesting because this is just
Mm.
like an example of where the
yeah,
weather kicked off a bad harvest, well, a series of bad harvests. But I mean, this was not the, of course, the only time this has happened globally for since people have been people.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
since we've been
Yeah.
making beer, that the harvest would get this, and then we'd have to make a decision. Okay, do we turn this into food or we turn this into beer? And then how much do we turn into food and how much do we turn into beer? And like, what's the line? And who decides that? And how do they
Yeah.
decide that?
Yeah. And
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken, when we spoke about our we had an episode on the Reinheitsgebot, and one of the things that came out was that the Reinheitsgebot was actually less about purity of beer, more about controlling which grains are allocated to which kinds of things. So, barley can go for beer, but wheat and rye go for bread.
right.
It was much more about thinking about food security alongside beer, which is, ostensibly a luxury. It's not a necessity in most time periods. So, yeah, that's really interesting.
It's kind of this interesting dynamic though, because a lot of like, so for example, like army rations, a lot of army rations were like on the basis, a lot of them, in particular 1600s or even medieval, are talking about beer and bread and putting them together. And so
Yeah,
um even during, if I remember correctly, so in a similar time frame in Ireland, you see like forces and troops talking about how they want beer and bread. Like these are the two things together. So that's what they're demanding, or that's what they're stealing, or that's what they're whatever. And so it's interesting to see then when we're forced to make the decision between beer and bread, what we're choosing and how we're choosing it, because it does seem to be this very integral part of rations and what people were demanding. At least for a time period. This is not everywhere, not all the time, and et cetera, all the fun caveats. But yeah,
Mm, mm.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, speaking of that in that time period, you're talking about like the beer could be more commodified, if you like, because while it's not going any great distance, it could still be sold regionally potentially, like in the immediate, you know, sort of area. Whereas the bread, that's going to be in your village, in maybe the next town over, but it's going to be, you know, consumed immediately. Whereas the beer might have a little more life, if you like. It could be laid down somewhere potentially, or it could be sold again further down, you know, so it sort of say several towns over. But so again, there's that idea that someone's making money off of this and it's not me. So you want to kind of get in on what that, you know, that dynamic. So it's less, again, it's almost like you can't see it. So is it even happening? It's less direct than the bread would be, which, you know, you see someone making it, you have it. And of course you're seeing the same thing with beer at your local production level. So what's being made in your household, but then what's going on at the, you know, say the big mill down the road, and what's, you know, what's happening there. Like you don't know unless you're working there. So again, there's this, you know, especially in this time of sort of general suspicion of everyone anyway, because there's a war.
yeah.
It's crazy. So anything like this that's you've got a shortage, people are gonna freak out. Like their conspiracy theories must have been absolutely bonkers as well. So and we know they were, many of them. So there you go.
Well, and it's
Mm.
also the time frame you have the 1641 rebellion in Ireland, and then the suppression in Ireland, all the and so like they're fighting that as well as
Yeah.
what's going on in England, and then also this, and there's like lots of moving parts and pieces here, um, as there are also in most things in history, right? So much
Yeah.
context, but I just yeah, it's so important that we realize that things like weather can play a really integral part in a lot of crises in
Yeah.
history.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And I don't think that this idea of having good seasons and bad seasons is new,
Right.
obviously, you know, as we've just heard. And so if we bring it slightly more recent, you know, climate change is on the tip of everyone's tongue. It has been for many years now already. But you know, we're already used to tempering our expectations based on good rain, good harvest, bad harvest. But what I'm starting to see is that a lot of people are talking, okay, it's not just because this year's, you know, winter was particularly wet. We have, you know, not enough barley, not enough vegetables. You know, might need to import instead of, you know, growing locally. That sucks, but that's a natural part of cycles. But what would it take to really fundamentally change the face of beer?
Yeah, and I think that the thing that I kept seeing again and again in the articles that were coming up, like there's so much focus on hops, and I
Mm,
think that's because of a fundamental misunderstanding that like the general public have, where they think beer is made from hops and not just that it's an ingredient in beer. And I think the other interesting thing there is there's so much research going on with like breeding hops, and so I think there's so much work, so much sort of focus in saying, okay, well, if these climate changes happen, we are breeding these kind of hops that where maybe you get a higher yield from lower numbers, you know, all of these sorts of things, which is not to say that's not happening in grains as well. Of course, there's that kind of work too, but it's almost a little more or maybe it's just harder to shift that, because like if you have a bad, you know, if the hops harvest is bad, you're gonna have just sort of slightly different beers. You know, they're just not going to be as hoppy because it's going to be very expensive. But if you don't have your barley, you don't, you're not having anything that we would recognize as beer. So to your point, Andy, like you'd have to start looking at alternatives like sorghum, or, you know, a different base, because it's really all about the grain at the end of the day. And I know that certainly there's a lot of concern with the whiskey industry here as well, that it's getting harder and harder to guarantee your barley crops. So if you've got kind of both the beer and whiskey industries here sort of being like, y'all, we're worried, like that's, you know, how do you solve that? You either have to, like you're saying, import it, or, you know, start
mm.
buying up land someplace else that you grow your kind of backup barley. So it's it's kind of like, which of these things is the fundamental? And at least for me, like, it's the grain, but it's like the hops are always like a wild card anyway. So
Yeah, and you can also use other herbs. I mean, we can go back to
absolutely.
using rosemary. There's all kinds of things that we can use. Um, but then equally, barley, and then there's wheat, there's oats, there's
Yeah,
rye, there's, corn, rice, sorghum, pumpkin. I
yeah,
mean, we could use turnips, parsnips. They used to make beer out of peas, beans. So there's lots of substitutes for that as well. Um, but with everything, it's what can we grow here? How
yeah,
much can we grow? And then what do we put for food versus this is a luxury, item.
yeah,
Well, and now certainly in our culture now it is
right.
in Ireland and most of the West.
Mm.
It would be a luxury item. Um, so you kind of have to figure out again, like what are we going to allocate to where, and like is this something that we're going to see in our lifetime? It sort of depends on how the climate crisis emerges. Um,
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
things sound really dire and others,
Yeah,
but I did read several articles in preparation for today talking about how people are arguing that beer is going to start tasting worse, that we're definitely going to see a big impact in the brewing industry that people have been talking about since, I think I saw, like, at least I saw articles back to 2015, like this is happening, and it's going to keep happening, and it's going to
Definitely.
keep getting
Definitely.
worse.
yeah. Well, there was already
um
that big hop shortage. What was it? It was like 2012, 2011. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was, and that was a big deal at the time. But again, the short term effect was just everything was more expensive because you could still get what you needed, but it was, a lot more expensive, and you might not necessarily make the styles you wanted just based on what you could afford. But again, when you have more of that, you know,
Now, that brings me to, I think, what I find at least the most interesting out of this idea, right? Which is, we're not only contending with things like hop shortages or barley, growing conditions, but we are, regardless, whether it's cyclical, whether it's climate change specifically, that's fine. But how does it change our own perception and appetite for different kinds of beers? So,
yeah,
for instance, there is still a time, we're living it, where we are very used to consistent, predictable beer from the companies that sell it. And I'm talking about the big boys, your Heinekens, Guinnesses. You almost never find a Guinness that doesn't taste like the other Guinness that you
right,
had a week ago. Consistency is the thing, right? If we have inconsistent growing conditions or ingredients, are we going to start letting go of a little consistency, or does it just become more expensive? Like, we know that. And does it affect the commercial kind of macro brewers differently than it does the micro brewers? Because one of the things, and I think I actually might have made a prediction, but somewhere, and I can't remember, and it was maybe just after COVID, and I wondered, because of the economic climate that we've all been in, rising costs of everything, everybody's suffering, everybody's struggling. But I wondered if things like beers that don't have as many expensive ingredients, like hops, would become much more the style of choice. Lagers take long, so they're kind of also expensive. Would we see more micro IPAs or, milds, anything, things that don't rely on a bucket load of hops because they're expensive or they're inconsistent, or, how does that affect what we're actually buying and selling?
Yeah,
yeah,
like I can speak to this just a bit from the perspective of like 19th century Ireland. Just when we're talking about malt and malt duty and things being expensive, just to give a comparison, because what you get into is economies of scale. So then the
Mm-hmm.
bigger brewers can make, because they're making more, it simply is cheaper for them to do so because they just get, it just is,
yeah,
to buy ingredients on a larger scale. You get exactly the economies of scale.
Yeah, they
And
got
so
buying power, don't
smaller
they?
yeah,
Yeah.
so you have smaller breweries closing, and they will, because they cannot compete with that kind of, you know things are just simply more expensive to them, because they cannot buy in those huge bulk quantities. Um, So yeah, I think that's going to be part of definitely going to be a consistent problem. Is there's it's just more expensive to operate. It's more expensive to buy your ingredients, and then because then you're going to have to turn that price over to the consumer at some point. Your beer is going to get priced out. People are just not going to be able to afford it because it is a luxury. So it's going to be one of the first things to go. Um, Unfortunately, I'm not. It's a really sad state of affairs, and there's lots of other things that go into that, like the cost of your energy going up, and all these other things, all can be related to climate crisis. But then we also have to think of like, um, are we, when we're using ingredients from far off, countries, and getting flown in, these are also things that contribute to climate change. So, are should we be doing that still? And even talking about these massive exporters, they're exporting all over the world. Should we be considering maybe more local ingredients? Should we be using more things from down the street? And obviously, like, I am definitely not the person to tell you that your individual activism is the same as like those top 11 companies that make up the worst things for
Right.
climate that we all know about. I'm definitely not that person at all. I just think maybe it's something that we need to think about, in the craft beer community. Like, okay, maybe we should really think about using more local ingredients, and
Mm.
maybe we should be growing things, working with like local farmers, um, and things like that. Maybe that would be a good thing to do.
And I think we're even sort of seeing almost the beginnings of that. At least if you, I don't know if it's happening as much here, but I know both in the US and the UK, the craft breweries that are staying sort of successful, which I'm air quoting, are the ones who tend to just be kind of very local or regional. The ones who have expanded sort of nationwide, regardless of what you sort of mean by that, are kind of the ones who are not doing as well, but the ones who have said, we want our footprint to be this and no bigger, seem to be doing really well. And I think, again, part of that is because it's local supply chains. They are using, they have those kind of local partnerships. A lot of it is stuff they might be either growing themselves or, sort of obviously contracting with like their neighbors effectively. So it's not even necessarily sort of cheaper overall, but certainly it's cheaper for them to like do business. And they can say, we want to stay this consistent size and support all of our local customers. And that seems to be kind of at least where we are at the moment with kind of what's doing well for people. Like it seems like there's a too big and then it's just not worth it anymore. But I think there's so much to be said for those local supply chains, those local relationships, and sort of saying, we're happy with this, and we've got the customers we need, and it's we're keeping them happy. And there's something about like that particular scale that seems to be like it's kind of a return to a kind of traditional way of doing business, if you like, I guess, but it seems to be much more sustainable in every possible way. So
Mm.
will we see more of these kind of very local, very regional businesses succeed? I think that's kind of the next big thing we're seeing hints of as a trend. So
Mm-hmm.
Mm. It is also interesting because, one of the questions that I think we've all asked and have been asked before is, did were styles dictated by demand or by supply? In terms
mm,
of, did the brewery tell us that we like lagers, or did we want lagers because they tasted better than something else? As a very crude example. And I think it's got one of those relationships where it's a little bit of both. There is
Mm-hmm.
a lot of power in demand, but there is a lot of power in spinning supply, and making it turning something into novel fun ideas, whether that is, like I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, like brewing a goza, or something with salt water because now there's not enough fresh water to go around, or um, saying, hey, try this new style because actually it was cheaper to brew. We don't always say that, but like,
yeah,
why not?
why not? Yeah,
Brewing possibly a brown ale is a lot cheaper than brewing an IPA. Brewing a pale ale is probably a lot cheaper than brewing a lager, only for energy costs.
sure.
There are probably costs and that are associated with all these different styles, whether it's storage, process, ingredients, and learning how to spin it in such a way that makes the consumer excited is probably part of the thing, right? That keeps people successful.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
absolutely.
people seem to really like, and I'm people. Um, like the hyper localness, like Lisa said, like, that there's something to be said about like green to glass. Like, okay, this was grown by the farmer down the street. The hops were, from my garden. And I know that there's issues growing hops in Ireland, but like
Yeah.
there's just the story behind that, and I think everyone can kind of relate to if a brewery was honest and was like, listen, like things are expensive. So we're gonna try to figure out the most economical way to still bring you really good beers to drink. We're gonna get as creative as we can with this. So it's not like we're cutting corners, but we're getting creative, and we're gonna try to
Exactly.
bring you
Yeah.
nice beers using local ingredients, and we're gonna experiment a bit, and we're gonna try this, and we're gonna try that, and we're gonna see where we land.
Mm,
Um, and I think a lot of people will be receptive to that. Um, you know,
I agree.
Anything with when people are very clear about what they're doing, I think people really like respond really well to that.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, just look at like all the great stuff Ballyclickhaven does. Because first of all, we all love Ballyclickhaven, fantastic stuff. But they're very honest about saying like it was hard to get the crop in the ground this year, or here's what happened last year, and they're very saying, and here's what this means. And I think it's great education for the consumer, first of all, to be like, oh,
Yes.
I hadn't thought
yeah,
about X or Y. But it's also really refreshing them to say, and here's what we're going to do, and here's what this means, but also to then see them investing like in the solar, and things like that, all these really sustainable things on the farm there, but also to see kind of what the hard things are, because as the consumer, do you think about it unless someone tells you? So it's kind of, again, it's we should have more education on these kind of things, and I think it's great if they're going to say, yeah, and here's why this was hard, but also, hey, look what we've managed to make out of this. And I think it's,
100%.
again, if it
Yeah,
means there's more mild, I'm not angry about it, so all
Yeah.
good. So
absolutely. And it is, I think it's one of those things where, we are going to go through these cycles. Climate change is a much bigger thing than just a cycle, but
yeah,
it just means that we're adapting, right? Throughout history and time, people have adapted and become innovative through challenges. So
absolutely.
maybe Ireland will, start being the hop growing nation of the world based on our sunlight, or so you never know. I don't know. Or maybe Ireland, known for its very wet weather, will go through many, many periods of drought because of, you just don't know. But everything shifts and changes. And I think it always looks as if it's dire and like, oh God, we're not going to have IPAs anymore. But actually, it changes quite slowly.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
and honestly, like, you'll find something else to love. Like,
Mm,
you'll always will find something else to love. There'll always be someone, please make a pea beer. That just sounds, I just want to try one. Maybe I'll be the
I'd be
person to make
curious.
a beer.
Hey, there you go. Yeah.
But yeah, like I just think there's always going to be amazing creative brewers out there that are going to present you with something that's wonderful.
mm,
And what's the famous quote? Necessity is the mother of invention. People will always, like you just said, Tandy, come up with really interesting things. And I think we have to trust our brewers to, in the breweries that we love, to do the best that they can. But we need to support them, and by talking about things like this, and being realistic. But yeah, I think we're going to see some interesting innovations, some probably by necessity.
Yeah,
yeah,
and I think if anything, it's up to the consumer to kind of lean on the big guys to make them drive some of this, because they have the resources to be doing research and investing in more sustainable practices. And some of them, to be fair, do that. But why not make it so that they have to do that? Like that would be an interesting
Yeah,
thing to say. If you have a certain size, you must contribute in some way to sort of improving these things. But don't, I
yeah.
think whether it's the carrot or the stick, it's up to them. But
All right. One final debate topic here. If we could guarantee through genetic engineering, if we could guarantee things like hops, barley in whatever weather we wanted to grow it, would that take away from your experience of beer, or would it actually be great, solves a problem? Like, how do you feel about something like that?
I mean, that's like all plant breeding throughout history is genetic engineering. It's just
True story.
how you're doing it. And like I know I'm not bothered about it. I'm like, hey, if it makes the stuff easier to grow and more sustainable in the long term, great. Like obviously you need
yeah,
safeguards in place as you would for anything, even if you were just doing very traditional crossbreeding. You don't want to like lose all of your like, kind of original stock. It's like anything. You were you want to be sustainable throughout the whole process. So it's it's about being a smart scientist. It's all good. So
Yeah. Like I think there's definitely a lot of scaremongering around the idea of like GMOs, genetically modified foods and things like that. I think it's a lot of misinformation because, like
yeah,
Lisa said, everything is. Although that said, I do think you have to be careful to get rid of like a lot of variation in different foods because then, you know, if something happens, then, we have only this kind in this particular thing. And if there's a particular blight or something that like likes that kind in particular, like that can be a problem. So I think
yeah,
variety is also really good. I love when people are bringing back like heirloom apples or heirloom
yeah,
tomatoes, these
definitely
kinds
love
of
that.
things. So I think having a really big variety of these things is also really, really important. So I do think, yeah, if we can make strains that are going to be particularly resistant to these kinds of things that we're encountering, there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think we should also be focusing on this variance and making sure that we're using old varieties if we can get
Absolutely.
those back. Things that grew locally that maybe we're not growing, maybe we should start growing them again. Reintroducing that sort of agriculture from like years ago and bringing back those sort of heirloom varieties and things. Because I think that's um, initiatives that I've seen globally, and I think that's just really, really cool.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. Love like all the seed savers and Irish seed savers and like all
Hmm.
of those are doing amazing stuff. And it's just really, really cool to see. And again, if anyone's read Pete Brown's book about apples, it's all about that. It's fascinating stuff. So highly recommended read.
Mm. Indeed. So there it is, friends. Change is afoot, but it always has been. We've always adapted to whatever's going on, whether it's climate or economic crisis or, styles or preferences changing. So, we'll just adapt as we always do, won't we?
Here,
So
here.
anything else to add, friends? Anything else before we close out?
Now I think we've done a good introduction. So we'll let other
Mm.
people take it from here.
Indeed. And as usual, we will share all of our links below or in the show notes, wherever or however you're watching or listening. And, if you liked it, like it, share it, do all the things. But otherwise, we'll see you next week. And we'll hopefully share some reels or things of Lisa and Katie on their Eurovision adventures because that's coming up now in the next week or so.
It
Um,
is indeed. Yes. Watch the skies.
love it. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining us at the Beer Ladies podcast. We will see you again next time. Bye now.